Welcome to Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is May 8th, 2012, and my guest is Ronlad Coase. Professor Coase won the Nobel Prize in 1991, and he is the author of two of the most important economics articles of the 20th century, The Nature of the Firm, published in 1937, and The Problem of Social Cost, published in 1960. He is perhaps one of the five most influential economists of the last 100 years, and I'm very happy that he has been alive for all 100 of those years and a little bit more, having been born in 1910. Professor Coase, welcome to Econ Talk.
Well, I'm very pleased to be talking to you, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to say.
First, I want to ask you about your youth. How did you get interested in economics? And how did you end up in the United States?
Well, you must realize I was born in London. I was born to parents who went to school, went to work in 12 years old. So they had very little education. So I had very little education either. I was very weak in my legs, and I went to a school for physical defectives run by the local council, and we were taught very little. I remember learning how to make a basket weaver, basket, and how to weave it. That was the sort of thing I was taught. I had very little education until I went to the secondary school.
And how did you get from a school for physical defectives to become a graduate student in economics?
Oh, I got a scholarship from the local council to go to the secondary school, the Kilburn Grammar School. And I went there, and while there, I studied, got a scholarship, and I'm trying to think just what I did. But I really didn't start studying until I got to a secondary school where I had a scholarship.
And in your career, when you were younger, which economists had the biggest influence on you, and who have you come to respect as an economist over the decades?
Oh, I didn't really study much at all. I didn't study economics until I got to the London School of Economics, where I went from a secondary school.
And when you were there at the LSE, which economists did you learn the most from?
Arnold, excuse me, Arnold Plant was the economist who taught me such little economics as I knew. I didn't really know very much then. I just studied with him. I took a degree in commerce. I never studied economics at all. We just studied a whole range of subjects like accounting and industrial law and so on. For a commerce degree, not an economics degree, and we really had very little economics at all.
Now, that still can be true in graduate school.
What?
Economics has changed a lot since then, and you've been critical of what you call blackboard economics.
Oh, yes.
What does that mean to you? What do you mean by blackboard economics?
Blackboard economics is an economics which you can put on the blackboard, in which you study an imaginary system. It's not empirically based at all. It's not concerned with what really happens. It's what you imagine could happen and what you imagine didn't happen. So I've been very critical of modern economics, which is too abstract. That's what blackboard economics is. It's something you can put on the blackboard, but now it doesn't exist.
So what do you recommend for...
I recommend more empirical work. Study what actually happens and start from there.
Modern empirical work in economics is very abstract as well, though. It has a lot of statistics and aggregates. That's not what you mean by empirical work, I don't think. I don't think you mean econometrics, right?
Oh, no. I don't mean the study that people do with a lot of statistics and so on, not finding out what really happens and getting conclusions based on these investigations, not on what actually happens, but on bunches of statistics. My view is that you should get down and study what actually happens. But economists don't do that, by and large.
No, it's rare. Well, let's talk about the problem of social cost. There's a famous dinner that took place at Aaron Director's house at the University of Chicago, where everybody thought you were wrong when the dinner started. But by the end of including Milton Friedman, who was, according to George Stigler, your biggest and most frequent adversary at that dinner. He talked the most, according to Stigler. But by the end of the evening, they all came over to your side. What do you remember about that dinner?
Well, it was more or less as was said. People started off thinking that I was wrong. And I couldn't see why they thought I was wrong. What I had done was to say 2 and 2 equals 4. And they had said, that isn't right, it's 5. It was a simple thing like that. I don't know why they thought I was wrong, since I didn't say anything that wasn't obvious.
Well, at least to you. I think they probably didn't think they thought it was 2 plus 3. So they thought 2 plus 2 is 4, but they thought it was 2 plus 3. So they thought you were talking about 5, I think.
Well, whatever it was a complete misunderstanding.
That must have been a lot of fun, the end of that dinner.
Well, it was. But I couldn't understand why they didn't understand why what I was talking about before. It was all a bit of a mystery to me. I thought I was stating the obvious, and they couldn't accept it.
But in one evening, they could. Sometimes it takes a lifetime for people to change their minds about such things. It's pretty amazing that that group only did it in a few hours.
Well, it did. It changed their views. But I don't know that it changed their views in a very sensible way, because they went on to talk about something called the Colors Theorem, and I never liked the Colors Theorem.
It is a common phrase. I also don't like it. I'll tell you why in a minute. But why don't you like it?
I don't like it because it's a proposition about the system in which there were no transaction costs. It's a system which couldn't exist, and therefore it's a quite imaginary.
Yeah, it's a straw man on a blackboard, I think would be the best way to describe it. It's for those who haven't read the paper, you should. It's accessible to anyone who understands English. It's the only language you have to understand. You don't have to understand the language of mathematics. And the idea of the paper is that when you're assigning property rights in the face of an externality, in the face of harm being caused by one party to another, the first part of the paper says that if transaction costs are zero, then... Yes,
well, in a way it's unfortunate that I did that. I only did that in order to explain my views. I thought let's talk about a system where there were no transaction costs. But it's an imaginary system. There always are transaction costs.
Well, it's like Galileo assuming there's no friction. But, of course, there is. So if you don't, you better plan on it. And it depends on, sometimes that friction is very important, sometimes it's less important. But the idea is that if there were no transactions costs, then when you assign property rights to the two parties, because there are no transactions costs, then it's easy for the parties to reassign rights, making side payments. But I always was taught, and I was taught this by Deirdre McCluskey when I was in Econ 300 at the University of Chicago, that the real lesson of your paper was that because transaction costs are not zero, you should assign the property rights very carefully. And ideally, you should assign them to the party. You should assign property rights so that the party who has the least cost of bearing the externality does so, because they might not be able to reassign the rights. It might be too expensive to renegotiate, so that the assignment of property rights is very important. That's what he told us the Coase theorem was. I know you don't like the phrase, but it's not so bad if at least he gets the insight right. I think the problem in the literature is that many people used the first part, if there are no transaction costs, as a straw man to say that you were wrong because, of course, they're transaction costs. Well, but you knew that. It was a terrible, unfortunate turn of events in the literature.
Yes. Excuse me, I just... Yes, it was a discussion at cross purposes in which the other party was had a completely wrong idea of what I was getting at. And it took a whole evening of all these economists to get it right. But then in the end they didn't get it right because they invented something called the Colors Theorem, which I don't like.
So part of your paper was a reaction to A.C. Pigou, who argued that in the face of an externality, positive or negative, we need to change the price that people face. If it's a positive externality, we should subsidize it. If it's a negative externality, we should tax it. And your point was that that's not necessarily true. And that in particular, sometimes it's better to do nothing and let the people who are harmed find an alternative way to avoid the externality or pay for the reducing the harm by the person whose actions are creating it. And yet, despite your paper and despite now it's been over 50 years, and I think it had a huge influence. Many people say it created the whole field of law and economics. It forced economists to look at transaction costs. It forced them to look at externalities in a different way. And yet the Pigou approach remains, I think, very much the standard way that people think about these things, even despite the fact that you, I think, did a very good job of calling it into question. Do you think I'm right?
Oh, you're right. Why people make the mistakes they make, I can't understand, but they go on doing it, and economics doesn't progress in the way I'd like to see progress. But stupidity is very common in all human activities.
Well, it's particularly common when it's hard to experimentally test results in complex systems. So people can persist believing lots of things that aren't necessarily true. They could be true, but they can't prove that they're true. They can't confirm their own suspicions and ideas. In social science, very difficult. If you had your way, which no man does, but if you had your way, what would you like that paper to have achieved? What would you want have happen in the real world from having written that paper? What policy do you think policy implications the paper has for legislation and legal systems?
I don't know that you can end up with the policy unless you study how things actually happen in the real world. And that's what I'd like to see people do, not all this abstract theorizing, all this mathematics and so on. I'd like to see people go study how things actually work, and then you know something. But by and large, this isn't what economists do. That's why I call it blackboard economics. It's abstract.
And of course, in the policy world, politics plays a big role. It's not just a search for the truth. I think about your 1959 paper on the Federal Communications Commission, which had some of the ideas of the problem of social cost in it. And you talked about the advantages of assigning property rights and letting people buy and sell access to the air for broadcasting, which eventually something like that happened. It took about 40 years. Were you
Yes.
were you surprised at that?
No, not after you've studied how things actually operate. It's surprised that it took as little time as 40 years. No, it's not possible to study how things are dealt with without realizing the importance of stupidity in human behavior. It's awful when you think how the war needn't have happened. The First World War, which I lived through, was an absolute tragedy, when millions of men were killed for no apparent reason. And the Second World War, when Hitler started it, needn't have happened at all. Hitler could have been stopped years before, but no one did it. And Chamberlain, if you remember, went and saw Hitler a year or two before the war started, got a piece of paper which he waved in the air and said, this excuse me. He said, this is peace in our time. And the war started 1 or 2 years afterwards.
Yeah, it was a bad prediction, and I can't say I remember it the way you do, but I do remember it. Speaking of that time, did you have contact with Keynes and Hayek, two great economists of that era in England?
Yes, I was very friendly with Hayek. I liked him, and he liked me, but we didn't have great contact. He tended to deal with these big questions, and I'm always interested in how the actual system operates, and therefore in much smaller matters than Hayek.
And how about Keynes? Did you know Keynes?
I can tell you, I was helping when Britain was trying to get a loan from the United States immediately after the war. And I was talking to one of Keynes's assistants, and Keynes came in the room and walked over to us, and the man I was talking to said, "This is Coase, who's helping us with the statistics. I don't think you know him." And Keynes said, "No, I don't," and walked off. And that's my life with Keynes.
It's short. That's very funny. Let's go back to let's talk about your 1937 paper, The Nature of the Firm. You were trying to answer a question which doesn't always. It's an interesting question because It's remains a good question. It was a good question in 1937. It's still a good question, which is if capitalism and markets and prices, the Hayekian system of communicating information via price signals, if it works so well, why do firms exist? Because firms are almost by definition top down rather than bottom up. They use command and control rather than purchases within the firm, although there are exceptions to that. Some firms do use price signals within their decision-making inside the firm, but many firms do not. Their decisions are made not by prices, but by fiat, by decisions on the top. Now, you wrote that paper when you were very, very young, the first part of it, correct?
That's right. I wrote it while I was an undergraduate. It seems obvious to me. If you go into a firm and you say to someone, "Why did you do this?" he'd say, "Because I was told to do it." He doesn't talk about pricing at all. Almost all the things you do within a firm are not controlled directly by prices at all. You know, your boss tells you what to do, and you do it.
And how did you come to write that paper as an undergraduate?
Oh, I was interested in how firms actually operate. And if you start studying how firms actually operate, you find that they are not concerned with prices directly at all. A person who is working in a firm does what he's told.
So
and that's the way it operates.
A firm is an island of socialism in a capitalist world.
Oh, well, I was a socialist at that time. That had some influence on me. I didn't start with the views that I now have, but I was a socialist. My parents voted for the Labour Party, and one important person that we knew was Ernest Bevin, who was General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union, which is the largest union in Britain. So in those early days, I was a socialist, and that may have had some effect in leading me to the nature of the firm. I don't know. Very likely.
So your insight was that firms act like socialists because it's cheaper.
That's right.
And it's cheaper because it's not free to use the price system.
It's cheaper because the price system is a very expensive system. If you think of all the things you have to know in order to make a bargain, it's obvious it's not a cheap system, and a system that that avoids negotiations or is one that saves a lot of costs.
So one of the things that I love about that paper is it forces you to think about these costs, which you might not notice. It forces you to notice that some systems that you think might not work so well actually work better than you think. But it's hard to test those ideas, right? You can't. One of the implications of the paper is that when transactions costs are high, you're more likely to use command and control. But you can't really, it's hard to measure transaction costs. It's hard to quantify the theory. Is that correct?
Yes.
Or is it irrelevant?
Well, no, it's very relevant. But the state of economics is such that people don't try to measure these things, try to study them. And so people can engage in discussion and explanation without any real knowledge of what happens in the real world.
So, in modern industrial organization, although your paper has had a huge impact and began a whole field within industrial organization, a focus on institutional issues, the new institutional economics, which influenced many, many other scholars. At the same time, there was the blackboard part of industrial organization, which is game theory and other aspects of industrial organization. But game theory became the predominant way that the economics profession thought about the behavior of the firm, where game theory is focused on strategic interactions between players with significant market power. What was your reaction to that literature and its influence on the study of the firm?
I think the influence was wholly bad because people developed highly theoretical approaches instead of approaches based on what actually happens. And it's only recently, really, that the people have begun to study what really happens as against engaging in what I called blackboard economics.
Do you think we understand the thing when I look back at the last 70 years of thinking about the firm, I'm not sure we've made much progress. It's true that people do occasionally spend some time looking at what actually goes on. There's one view that says the people who figure that out keep it to themselves because it's profitable. But other people than yourself, people like Harold Demsetz and others, have decried the state of modern theories of the firm. The defenders of game theory certainly remain enthusiastic about it despite your critique. And it is still a dominant approach, I think, for business students. I think many business students still are taught a great deal of game theory. The question is, what would you want them to learn instead? Now, it's one thing to say that economists should learn more about firms, but have we learned anything in the last 70 years that would be useful to a future executive or manager or student of economics?
I don't think so. I think that the economic treatment, the treatment by economists has, by and large, got worse, if that's possible. No, I think the time has come when we should study what actually happens and study firms and how they operate and learn from that.
The challenge,
and I think is going to happen in that narrow sense. I'm optimistic.
but you could argue that approach of studying what actually happens at firms, that's the essence of, say, the Harvard MBA, which is a case study approach, where you look at particular examples of what firms did in different situations. Sometimes it's an issue of strategy or marketing. And rather than make a grand general theory, you look at it, you go on a case-by-case basis. The problem with that is that every case is a little bit different. So it's hard to know. It's hard to generalize. It's hard to have a body of knowledge. Maybe all you end up with is a body of cases.
Well, we shouldn't give up an approach because it's hard. Life is hard. And it isn't. We shouldn't be looking for easy ways to do things, but for ways to solve the problem.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let me ask you a little bit about politics. Your paper on the problem of social cost and your paper on the lighthouse, which was published in 1974, which we have yet to talk about. It's a wonderful paper. It was one of my favorite papers. I remember reading it in graduate school, coming across it and being so excited about it. These papers have been used by people who are laissez-faire or free market oriented to suggest that the obvious case for government intervention in the case of externalities with the tax or regulation, or in the case of the lighthouse with public provision of a public good, that case is not so obvious. And what is your feeling about the political implications of those papers?
I'm not a person who thinks that the government should give up everything. How much the government should give up will be found by studying how the government operates. But the assumption that governments always do the right thing is not true. They make lots of errors, and where they're most likely to make errors can be found only by studying how governments operate. My approach to the subject of what government should do is to be based on studies of how governments actually operate. And I've had a lot of experience. I worked for the British government for many years, and I saw how decisions are made, and stupidity is very common.
Well, that's why trial and error and competition are often a better solution than one size fits all.
In some areas. I wouldn't say that's true in all areas. If you study the military and the conduct of war and so on, you find that the errors are enormous. I don't know whether you're familiar with what happened leading up to the war, but it was absolute stupidity. Hitler could have been stopped early on, but no one did it, and the result was a horrible war, the evil effects of which we still experience today.
No doubt. We were talking about understanding what government actually does, and you emphasized that it's important to study government. You were at the University of Virginia when James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock and others were pioneering what came to be called public choice. What was it like there, and what do you think of that work?
Well, I was there at the time when Buchanan was trying to build up a department, and I went there from Buffalo to be part of that. What we didn't realize was that the dean at Virginia thought we were all a lot of right-wing extremists, and he opposed everything we were trying to do, and finally succeeded in preventing Buchanan doing what he wanted to do, which was to build up a department. And Buchanan left, Tullock left, I left, Warren Nutter didn't leave because when he got an offer of a job at, I think, UCLA, the Vice Chancellor vetoed it. The reason was that Warren Nutter, who was making estimates of the Russian production, ended up with a figure lower than the official figure of the British government. This was thought to be due to his bias.
Yeah.
we now know that Warren Nutter's own figures were too high.
Yeah, as if the British government didn't have a bias either. Yeah. Going back to Buchanan and Tullock and Nutter, what did you think of their work, and what do you think of it now? Do you think it's the kind of economics you like or not like?
Well, by and large, it moves along lines that are not mine, and so I admired them. I didn't necessarily agree with them, and I just got on with my own work.
Yeah, you've always been listen to your own drummer. Thank God, it's a different drummer, and it's made economics a much more interesting field because of that. Let's turn to your latest work, which is on China. How did you get interested in China?
Well, I've been interested in China very superficially for a long time. I was very impressed by reading Marco Polo, And this was China in the 13th century. And it was a country in many ways ahead of what was going on in Europe or in Britain. And I thought it was a country that had great potential. And I still do.
So your new book is called How China Became Capitalist, which is co-authored with Ning Wang. How capitalist is China?
Well, it is very capitalist, but it's not capitalism as we know it. It's capitalism with Chinese characteristics, and this you would expect. But the country is being transformed, and it's not being transformed as people in Europe commonly think as a result of the Chinese government's operations, but as the result of what we call marginal revolution, changes that are taking place despite the Chinese government. There are these village enterprises. There are unemployed people who start businesses. It's all going forward in China without the control of the Chinese government. The Chinese government commonly doesn't know what's going on.
But there's still a large government role in the economy, and they steer a lot of resources. As I understand it, the government has done a lot of the building and infrastructure, much of it probably not going to be useful, not productive. So it's not, you're emphasizing the importance of the things they don't know about, but they do know about some things and they're very active, correct?
They're doing, the government is doing a lot of things, most of them being failures. It's an economy which, under the Chinese Communist Party, but the Chinese Communist Party commonly doesn't know what's going on.
How do you think that happened? There was a point where they had a much tighter control over things. Why did things loosen up to allow things that could happen that they didn't know about? And why did those things become so much more important?
Well, I think China is a very big country, and it's very difficult to control. It's very difficult to know what's going on, and so things can happen. There's a Chinese saying, and I don't know that I have it completely correctly. The mountain is high and the emperor is far away.
That's a nice expression, even if you have it wrong. That's a very Hayekian expression. It's about the knowledge problem, right?
Yes.
There's local knowledge that only the people in the vicinity have. I would add, the mountain is high, the emperor is far away, and sometimes he has no clothes.
Yes. Well,
do you think Chinese prosperity But we talked earlier about Warren Nutter's estimates of Russian production, and that they were much lower than the official estimates, and ended up being lower than what we actually found out to be the case. I wonder if anybody really has any idea of what's actually going on in China, especially when so much of what is measured is probably that government activity that is, I'm not sure they're measuring it correctly. I'm not sure if you can measure it correctly. So I'm not sure. China's definitely getting, the standard of living there is improved. There's no doubt about that. How much, I think, is hard to say. And do you think it will persist?
Well, Vogel has made estimates which are very great for the future, and I think he's probably right. Whether the growth in China will be as great as he has estimated, we don't know. But it could be. It could be higher, because I think that there's a large possibility for further growth in China. The output per capita, the productivity of workers in China is now very low. Their output is great because their population is great.
Right. Yeah, people, I think on many fronts, people misunderstand the impact of China's success and its significance. I believe it's a good thing for the world and good for the Chinese, because the Chinese people are a big part of the world, so I'm happy to see them doing better. But a lot of people think it's bad for the United States, and I don't agree with that. Do you?
No, I don't. Our productivity ahead is vastly greater than that in China, and likely to continue so.
What do you think is the state of property rights in China these days? As someone who's spent much of his life thinking about the importance of property rights and the assignment of property rights and the costs of reassigning property rights, how is China doing on that front?
Very badly. China has a long way to go to catch up with the West in terms of productivity, in terms of the institutions required to make a really good economic system. And that's why I think we're going to see further growth in China. It's got a long way to go.
But of course, we don't know if their political system will create the right incentives for that growth.
Oh, it gives some bad incentives, but things have happened largely outside the government control. The private farming, for example, in agriculture, has developed while opposed by the government, or even made it illegal by the government. But it's gone ahead because the government cannot control everything. And the same is true in many other areas. So you've had an extraordinary situation in which, under the Chinese Communist Party, you have had a growth of markets and private ownership and so on.
In those private settings, are there contracts and informal contracts, or are they using the legal system but in their own way?
It's a very undeveloped legal system, and things have happened without a proper legal system. That's why it's now being developed, why we can expect the growth in China is going to continue. It's got a long way to go. And it's not very innovative. They produce a large part of their stuff on the basis of orders from abroad.
Yeah.
So that what is produced is not determined in China, but is determined in Europe and the Americas.
Yeah, right now they're the workshop of the world. Whether they will be something different in 25 years, I guess, remains to be seen.
That's right. They do things that other people describe and want done. But that won't continue.
Right.
And as China becomes more innovative, their production will become more valuable and more significant. We know very few Chinese I'm trying to think what the word is. Trademarks.
Patents.
Patents. It's all developed in America and Europe, and then the Chinese do the things to order.
Yeah, that will change. You're right. That will change.
That will change. And as it changes, Chinese production will go up and be more valuable. And it's got a long way to go. And it's a big country. It's a quarter of the world's population.
It's kind of amazing. Well, we're almost out of time. I just want to ask you one last question. You've mentioned a few times that there's a lot of stupidity in the world, and having been born in 1910, you've been blessed and unfortunate enough to see a great deal of it. World wars, genocide, bad economics, but there have been lots of good things. And overall, since 1910, the world has gotten remarkably more pleasant if you survived those things. Of course, it depends where you were born and where you grew up. But it makes you wonder. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the future, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist about the human enterprise.
Well, I'm an optimist. The opportunities are so great, and I think people would take advantage of them very slowly, of course, and not without further mistakes. But I'm optimistic about the future, and I hope I'm right.
So do I. It's been a great honor to have you on the program, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. My guest today has been Ronlad Coase. Thanks for being part of Econ Talk, Professor Coase.
Goodbye.
This is Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more Econ Talk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for Econ Talk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.